Hello and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to the show. Today we're going to do something kind of controversial. Randall has got a unique and powerful take on Vietnam War movies. But before we start, as always, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Comments being the most important, especially after you're going to hear what Randall has to say on this show. Randall, what's an effective way to reach us?
Well, check out our website, chrisandrandall.com. Also, you can go to Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall, our Facebook page, and tell us how much, whatever your opinion is.
We want to know, good, bad, or indifferent. Now, I don't know where this particular episode will appear in the sequence, but about an episode or two ago, actually two or three, we did a one on the 20th century as seen through 21st century music biopics. And I had said at the time that in the 20th century, one of the great ways that we would re examine social history was through war movies. And certainly, I would say Vietnam movies were quite popular in the mid to late 70s and then had a resurgence in the late 80s. And we're all about the Vietnam War. Now, Randall, that's all I'm going to say, except one disclaimer. Randall's opinion is not my opinion. I'm not here to debate Randall's opinion. I just want to explore it. So, Randall, what's your take, man?
Well, okay, so I grew up watching a lot of Vietnam War movies. I was born in 75, and the Vietnam
The end
War...
of the Vietnam War.
The end of Vietnam War pretty much ended in 75. So I was born the year it ended, and then
What month were you born again?
June.
Right around the fall of Saigon.
So Vietnam movies, they didn't, they didn't make a lot during the war because, the American people understandably didn't understand why we were there. I think for the most part.
Ballad of the Green Beret with John Wayne as the only one I can remember. I'm sure there was something else.
Right, I believe that's famous for being the only Vietnam War movie made during the Vietnam War, which I haven't actually seen, but but I've heard it's just like a very standard patriotic war movie. But the thing is like after the war ends, and after the war ends, you end up getting a lot of you end up getting some movies that go back and try to examine the war, right, Chris? So like,
Yeah.
one of the big ones was what was the first big one? Won the
Well,
Oscar and everything.
it's weird. 1978, you have two very big Vietnam War movies that come out, and one that I guess we can talk about whenever. The first one that came out in 1978 that won a lot of Oscars was called Coming Home. Technically, not about the Vietnam War as much as soldiers returning from the Vietnam War. That was, I believe, Jane Fonda, who has a big relationship with the Vietnam War, Bruce Stern, and was it Chris Christopherson? Yeah. And then in late 78, another Oscar film that will do quite well is The Deer Hunter.
Deer Hunter, right. And then 79, I'm looking at a list
Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now comes out. Let's see, what else? So one of the most seminal Vietnam War movies is probably Platoon that comes out in 86.
Well, that's part of the second wave. So I would say the first wave goes from like 78 to like 80, 81 max. And then you get like Rambo First Blood 2, which is 86, which
right.
isn't
Then
a
you have the
Vietnam movie.
Rambo movies, and what else, Chris?
Well, then you get to like, then you do get stuff like Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, Casualties of War, Hamburger Hill, what is it, Stone, the one about the cemeteries. Yeah, they're basically like, it's two different waves. There's the first wave of Vietnam War movies that come out really about 5 years, not even 3 years after the Vietnam War. And then there's the other movies that come out about 10 years after the Vietnam War, if that's how you want to look at it from a historical standpoint. And then I guess Vietnam War movies, they never stopped coming out after the mid 80s. I mean, there's a pretty, you've got the list, right? It goes right into the 21st century.
Well, I have a list here. Yeah, sure. I have a list here of like Military Times did a top 10 Vietnam movies of all time. I'll just read it off because like we're getting to it already. So Number 10 was Casualties of War, 1989. That stars Michael J. Fox and Sean
I saw
Penn.
that. Yeah, that's is that Brian De Palma?
I think it might be. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
sure. Okay, then Rescue Dawn, 2006. That's the Werner Herzog movie.
which is
Uh,
based on a documentary that Warren Herzog had done.
right. Well,
It's
so
actually
true.
one of the few times where a documentarian makes his own live action film. That's with Kristen Bale.
We Were Soldiers, 2002. Um,
That's a Mel Gibson one.
yeah, I think so. It's based on Vietnam War's first major battle. Hamburger Hill, 1987, which you already mentioned. Born on the 4th of July, 89. Good Morning Vietnam, 87, with Robin Williams.
Hotel Hanoi is around then as well.
Full Metal Jacket,
87.
87. Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, and then number one Platoon, according to Military Times. You also you put me onto a movie. What was it called?
Well, it's made between. It's funny because it comes out just between Deer Hunter and Coming Home, and it's Go Tell the Spartans, which is also 1978, starring Burt Lancaster.
Right.
And
So what I want to say is about Vietnam War movies. All these Vietnam War movies have a certain kind of defect, and it's a defect in that they're lying by omission. They're either lying or lying by omission. Okay, and they're lying about what the United States is doing in a country like Vietnam. Because what's going on is the United States is an empire and has been an empire since at least the Spanish-American War, since at least it took over the Philippines. And not a lot of people even know this, Chris.
yeah,
I learned a history. I learned this in How to Hide an Empire: A History of the Greater United States, which is a great book about the U.S. Empire.
who's
Looking at
the
the U.S.
author?
Huh?
Who's the author? If someone wants
I
to read
don't
that.
remember. But
Okay, well, Google it, folks.
so anyway, this is a great book. So a lot of people don't know this, but the United States, in like around 1899, took over the Philippines, fought the native Filipinos to eventually take over the Philippines. It was the longest American war until Afghanistan, I think. it, and people don't even know this. And then the United States, the Philippines was a U.S. territory up until World War II. And when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they also bombed Manila. And the bombing of Manila was one of the worst incidents in terms of destruction, human life lost ever in the history of the Philippines. Also, Chris, it was probably one of the worst incidents in the history of the United States. Or, I mean, how do you define America? I mean, if you define the Philippines as part of the United States, then it was one of the worst incidents in the history of the United States. Although people in the United States don't know about it. I mean, this is nearly the obscenity of the U.S. empire, right? The U.S. is an empire that pretends to not be an empire. So when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in the Philippines, FDR decided this was the perfect time to bring the United States into the war in Europe. But how do you do that? How do you get the American people on your side? Well, he maybe rightly thought that people in the United States would have no desire. They wouldn't care anything about what happened in the Philippines, even though technically at the time the Philippines was part of the United States. Okay,
It was a territory.
well, yes, but it was. I mean,
Well, so
Hawaii.
just to clarify, so people don't think it was anything but a territory. It's
But what is a
very
territory?
empire-sounding word, by the way. A territory.
What is a territory?
it's a
I mean, it's
possession.
part of the United States.
Well, I'm just saying, but a territory is more of a possession than a state.
Well,
state,
if well,
the state
if
is democratic, right?
well, if
you live
if,
in California, you
Well,
have
Chris,
representation. If you're
Chris.
a territory, it implies you're occupied.
Chris, if what were the Filipinos? Were they U.S. citizens at the time when the Philippines was a territory?
No, I'm defending your point, Randall.
Okay.
It's just that I'm just saying, if you're making the argument of as America as a colony, I'm just saying you might as well draw the distinction between the first class people, which are the citizens of the empire, versus those who are just the subjects of the empire and clearly the Filipinos the Philippine people and Philippine nations were under the boot of
Well,
the American
one of the
Empire.
first things that happened. Okay, so FDR gives us famous. This is a what is it? This is a night that will live in infamy, a day that will live in infamy
Oh,
speech.
you're talking about Pearl Harbor. Yeah, that's what he said. December 7th,
But he
1941.
could have mentioned Manila in that speech, but he didn't because he may have thought Americans wouldn't have cared about the Philippines.
And he would have probably been right.
Probably been right. But my point in saying this is this is a practically secret history of the United States that people in the United States don't understand, and you see this kind of history, this kind of false history, this kind of like history by omission given in these Vietnam War movies. I grew up watching these movies, and I feel like they left out the story. You know, they left
Can
out
I
the real story of the
can
Vietnam
I
War.
can I just be your straw man for a moment?
Sure,
State the conventional wisdom. I
sure.
think it'll just draw
Sure?
your
Go ahead.
argument out.
Go ahead.
So, okay, the Vietnam War movies prior to the really prior to after the Vietnam War, really up to the early 1970s, all American war movies, whether they're about the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War One, World War II, followed a very traditional formula, which is the U.S. is always right. Whatever the member of the armed forces was, be it a sailor or an army man, a marine, a pilot, they were always on the side of good. And whoever the enemy was just pure evil incarnate. So it was a very, I think the word is Manichaean. Is that correct? It was a world of
Manichaean, black and
Manichaean.
white, good and evil.
Everything is like there's only good and there's evil, and the U.S. is always the force of white and light, and it's here. And considering that
Well,
America had had a victory in World War II that was very unambiguous by the standards of the day, when they first started making Vietnam movies or even framing it on TV or just in popular culture, it was just another Korean War, World War II kind of, hey, rah, rah, America. Then, and I just want to get to the conventional wisdom so you can tear it down all you like. Um, Once late 60s happened with the Gulf of the Tet Offensive, once Americans saw what was going on, and then into the 70s when they understood that the government, bombed Hanoi secretly. Once we realized that we were not the heroes, there was these anti-war films that basically the first round, the stuff from the 70s, either focused on what the soldiers' life was like when they came back, which was very poor, and how emotionally scarred they were, or it was about how soldiers, individual soldiers, uh, found themselves involved in a war that was not the war they thought they were going to be in. And then I guess the second wave that comes out in the late 80s is almost an anti-Reagan feeling, where now they have the great special effects. You have a lot of people who have served in the war who are giving more the grunt's eye view. I'd say that it's more Hollywood cinema in the 70s, and it's more the people who had fought in the war or who now were in their late 30s to early 40s. And
okay, well
and
that's kind
so
of
that's what I'm going to say. I mean, let me just state the conventional wisdom, which is the all of these movies that you had on your list, none of them praise the U.S. All of them state moral ambiguity. All of them, for the most part, have idealistic heroes who find out they're naive and that the U.S. government isn't really the hero, or that their fellow captains and or fellow soldiers are not all on the same page. And I would say about 90% of those stories, there is a hero, a protagonist, and he's a good guy who gets caught up in something.
yeah. Okay, so
Does
yeah,
that seem
that's
fair?
no part of it.
As a
No,
formula. I'm just saying the formula.
no
I'm
part
not
of it.
saying it's
No,
accurate.
because here's the problem. Here's the problem. Because yeah, sure, part of the formula
I'm just
is
saying that's the formula. I'm not saying it's right. Let me be
right,
very
but
clear.
part of the
I'm just
formula. Okay,
saying,
okay, but part of the formula you're describing is that yes, there is a character who is good, who is a good person, like Casualties of War, for instance. Michael J. Fox witnesses his fellow soldiers committing atrocities in front of him, and he wants to do something about it. Right? He wants to do the right thing, the ethical
Martin
thing.
Sheen and Apocalypse Now, Charlie Sheen and Platoon. They're like, they're the innocents. So we're going along on the ride, losing our innocence along with them.
Right. So that's so that does happen in these movies. But there was one thing I think that I take issue with is that um, you're saying these movies seem to imply that the United States has some sort of good intentions
Well, I'm
in
just saying
Vietnam.
that if you watch, and I'll just randomly pick everything off that list, and I'll say two very different movies, but very much the same idea. Is The Deer Hunter? They're rangers who basically lose their soul and end up being almost dehumanized, and that's the one variant of the hero's journey in the Vietnam War, that they lose their soul and they're broken. And the other variant is Good Morning Vietnam, where they're trying to do their own thing, and they think that through the strength of their own moral compass they can do right, and then they find out the situation is greater than they understand, and they too kind of leave a little bit on the broken end.
Okay, I guess I'm going to be really glib and just say that I think that the problem with all these ideas, these movies, is that they are not explaining why the U.S. is in Vietnam. And the U.S. is in Vietnam because it is trying to perpetuate basically like a colonial empire. And the proof of this is that when the French are trying to pull out of Vietnam because it's a French colony, the United States says, no, we're going to move in and we're going to fill that vacuum with us. And they install a puppet government and they support the puppet government, and they want to try to rule Vietnam through this puppet government and extract whatever riches or whatever they can out of Vietnam through this puppet government. And that's really what's going on. That's what's going on with the Vietnam War. So the United States doesn't have good intentions in Vietnam, and that's, I think, a major issue that all these movies end up glossing over. Right?
Well, I'm sorry. I just want to stop you here because no and yes. I just want to be very clear. In these movies, clearly the top brass, while never really seen, or they're embodied by maybe a captain or a lieutenant, are considered, they're in the wrong. It doesn't get beyond the fact that normally, like you've seen Apocalypse Now, you've seen Robert Duvall, right? He goes, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. He is a helicopter infantryman, and it's to show you how cold-blooded and destructive and sociopathic he is. Now you could argue that also any scene where the Martin Sheen character is meeting with the office, with his superiors, telling him what to do, they're bad. But I'm not saying, just want to be really clear, I think what you're saying, and I think it's a good point, is that they tend to personalize what is wrong in the command, but they don't really ever give you you never understand it's deliberate, that the United States, this is policy. These aren't bad men.
Well, I haven't gotten to that point yet, Chris.
Is that
but
what
yes.
you're trying to say?
No, that's not what I'm trying to say right now. That's not what I'm trying to say right now. Right now, what I'm trying to say is these movies do not answer the question why we're in Vietnam, because the answer to why we're in Vietnam is pure evil. Okay, the United States is in Vietnam because it's trying to perpetuate a colonial, an oppressive colonial system, and it's trying to do it by force. And none of these movies even makes an attempt to explain that. Okay, and so that's one problem. Now, what you just said, yes, that's true as well, right? Will you repeat that again, Chris?
Well, it seems to be that it's as you said, there's a certain glibness, right? So normally, if you look at the bad guys who represent the military top brass, it's normally somebody who's very either they're faceless, and it's like, oh, word came down from HQ, we've got to kill everyone in this village, or it's one or two like Robert Duvall military prig types who comes in and go, they're the enemy and we're going to kill them because we hate them. So that it's either one of two things psychologically, right? Either it's a good guy working for a bad commander, or the orders that are coming from above, they're just kind of mysterious, like the Force in the Star Wars movie. We know more about the Sith and the Sith's motivation.
Right. All these Vietnam movies
series that we know about the U.S. government.
Right. All these Vietnam films. Right. All these Vietnam movies have the same problem. It's like the characters in these movies get orders from on high. What is the purpose of these orders? And we never find out. Right. But I'm telling you, that is a lie by omission. That's the problem with all these Vietnam movies. It's like, because these movies cannot admit the central fact that the United States was evil. And the United States was doing evil things. That's why the United States was in Vietnam, to be evil. Okay, so let me, you know what, Chris, you
Well,
suggested,
I mean,
you
just even if
suggested,
you're saying there's two things. I just want to. You said two different things. I just want to shine a light on it, which is it's very hard to talk about evil for me because it's such a very subjective and philosophical term. But just for those of you who don't know a lot about the war, originally the French in the 1950s fought the Vietnam War. We replaced the French in the 60s. We came in as advisors, and then by the mid 60s, we actually became a force of occupation. We went from having like 50 to 100 advisors to almost 150,000 troops. So I just want to get your point, which is that I do believe there's a lot of empire building that you talked about at the beginning, right? We're building the empire in our hemisphere from the 1890s, spanning out into the Pacific as we get into the 20th century. And I think what you're trying to say, and I think it's a very smart one, is that once World War II ends and the Cold War begins, the United States justifies a certain hegemonistic ambition by saying we're not being empire builders, we're defending good people from communism. But in truth, we're defending people from communism means we're taking over your country, we're telling your people who to run your government, how to run your government. We're taking your natural resources and taking them to our country because we're capitalists, but this is all for your own benefit. And that's I think the one thing that I was waiting for you to kind of address.
well, I haven't gotten there yet, but yes, I agree. That's the United States since 1899 and the Spanish-American War. The United States has been building an empire. Any place in the world where the old colonial powers weakened, like in Vietnam, the United States merely stepped in and tried to fill that vacuum and take over. But yeah, so did you want to add anything else? Because like I wanted to get to.
I just wanted to say that I feel like when you're dealing with Vietnam Wars, that a lot of the time, not all, but when you're not dealing with a person who's completely like destroyed and hollowed out, you often get this like Adrian Cronauer, he's here to do good, you know? And you do get these guys in Vietnam Wars who are like, I'm here to do good. I'll find out that I'm not really doing good, but I'll still find a way to do good, even though I'm not doing good, which is a very mixed.
Right. I'll put it like this. I'll put it like this,
right?
Chris. It's as if okay, let's say it's like back during slavery times. And I know anybody listening to this is going to think I'm crazy for saying this, but back during slavery times, let's say it's pre the American Civil War. Ships are going to Africa, picking up slaves, bringing them back. You said, you know what? I want to start a slave transportation company to do the most good, to try to help these people, to try to help everybody. I mean, what you see what I mean, Chris? It's like everybody going to Vietnam.
It's a very good secondary point, which is actually most Civil War movies really do a piss poor job of dealing with slavery.
Everybody, yes. Well, everybody going to Vietnam, Americans, are going there to, in a basic sense, are going there to perpetuate the American empire and to oppress the Vietnamese people in any way possible so that the American empire can maintain its control and keep Vietnam a colony. So there are no good intentions at base, okay? Now, there might be individual soldiers that go over there and think they're doing something like, I don't know, fighting for democracy or something like that.
And they normally find out, oh my God, I was wrong. I was wrong, but I'm still a good guy. I'm just a good guy who learned that my country, not me, no moral problem on my end, just my country was bad. What can I say? I was sorry, showed up at the wrong place at the wrong time.
True. And I will say that in the scope of history, in real life, yeah, of course, there were probably maybe a majority of Vietnam soldiers, draftees, went over there thinking they were doing something like helping fight for democracy or something, or defending democracy, or fighting communism, right? A majority probably did think that. Yeah. And then they were completely disillusioned when they got there, of course. And that's what some of these movies are about, right?
But
But
it
that's
really, I get what you're saying, which is that these are
so I
not
don't fault
really,
them. I just want to say I
they're
don't
not,
fault them.
they're not really historical dramas then, right? They're moral stories. They're personal stories that you could transpose it to anywhere, right? Like theoretically, it could be about a German soldier who thinks he's fighting for the good of the
Yeah,
right,
I mean, so all
finds
these
out really, oh, being a Nazi is terrible.
right, all these so it's almost like if you made the equivalent of a Nazi of a Nazi movie, it would be like some German soldier hears about Auschwitz and he says, "Oh, they're helping the Jews at Auschwitz become good people," and then he goes there and he's disillusioned. Right?
Right,
That would be like that, or
right. And I
um,
want to be really clear. We're not saying we're not we're not equating anything here. We're just saying that there is a certain, I would call it a moral get out of jail free card, because if every soldier in every war is just really an innocent chap who accidentally signed up for the wrong thing and now got stuck with a bunch of bullies who don't know any better, it really reduces the entire nation's moral culpability in a war, because now it's just a bunch of good guys and bullies.
oh my God, Chris, you said it so good right there. That's exactly what I'm thinking. You perfectly stated that point. My point. Yeah. So all these movies are trying to absolve the United States of guilt, almost.
Well, because when you leave the theater, you can walk away going, well, that sergeant was really terrible, or that lieutenant was really bad, or those poor boys who went around killing women and children, they really had to live with that for the rest of their life. Or, that invisible HQ that is giving them orders to do what they're doing. If I ever met them, I'd give them a piece of my mind. But it really, it cauterizes the wound, right?
Right. And
It, it dulls the part that you should be feeling.
right. And you can also walk away from all these movies thinking, oh, if it wasn't for a few bad apples, a few
Yeah.
corrupt Marines or a few corrupt, officers or politicians or whatever, we could have won the war. When in fact, it wasn't even a war. It was actually um, uh, an oppressive police action. Okay, and I'm not saying that to like sound like one of these politicians that talks about like Vietnam wasn't really a war, because it wasn't really a war. Okay, so let me go into like, because Chris, you asked me to say this when we're talking about this, but
Yeah.
what is the perfect Vietnam movie? What would an actually good Vietnam movie be like?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm gonna start talking about this, and I think if the audience wasn't agreeing with me yet, they're gonna agree with me now, because the main facet of the U.S. conflict in Vietnam, or the main force, was the Phoenix program.
Oh, what is the Phoenix program,
The
Randall?
Phoenix program was an all-encompassing strategy for oppressing the Vietnamese people, for defeating any kind of communist influence within the Vietnamese population, okay, and rooting them out. It was envisioned as a counterinsurgency program. So you had the insurgents. So you had the United States have a puppet government controlling the people of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and you had certain underground groups, right, insurgent groups fighting against that control, that oppression, trying to overthrow the government, trying to turn people to communism, like in the North, trying to unify Vietnam, and certain people in the military and the CIA came up with this idea that they would use some of the similar underground tactics that the insurgents were using against them. Okay, but because it's the United States has a lot of resources, and because they have a puppet government, they basically have outward control of the nation. They were able to do this on a grand scale. So what does it look like? They basically had to. The Phoenix program was the organizing principle of the conflict in Vietnam, and I'll just talk about a timeline here. So the Vietnam War, our involvement in Vietnam in the United States starts in 1955 to 1975, but the Gulf of Tonkin starts in 1964. So from like 1955 to 1964, Vietnam is like on the simmer with the United States.
Well, and from that period of time, it's just a bunch of advisors. Just to be really clear, we are not an armed presence in that country. We are just sending out rangers, military advisors to work with the North Vietnamese to give them information and training, and maybe go out with them on missions, but we're not an actual force until
Yeah,
65.
in terms of pure numbers, yeah, our involvement was small. So Gulf of Tonkin incident is 1964. Now Phoenix program starts in 1967, so it isn't long after. And Phoenix program continues at least until 1972. So, we leave in the 75. So most of the action of Vietnam happens when Phoenix program is part of the main organizing principle of our response to Vietnam. How many of these Vietnam movies mention the Phoenix program? Zero. Not one of these movies mentions the Phoenix program. Now let me, and when I say that these movies are lying by omission, that is the biggest lie, I believe. Okay, because not mentioning Phoenix program is like, I don't know, not mentioning the Confederacy in a Civil War movie. Okay, it's not mentioning Hitler in a movie about World War II. Okay, it's absolutely ridiculous. Because the Phoenix program, okay, I'll just go into the Phoenix program. So it was, first of all, the idea was you're going to root out all the secret communists who are fighting against you in South Vietnam. Okay, it could be anybody. It could be anybody in any walk of life in South Vietnam could be a secret communist fighting against the United States. Okay, and so we're not talking about fighting a war like out in the jungle. Here's another lie these movies go into. Okay, we're not talking about fighting a war out in the jungle. We're not talking about a conventional war. We're not talking about armies facing off, squaring off against each other on a battlefield. Okay, that was rare in Vietnam. That sort of conflict, like a World War II style conventional conflict, was incredibly rare in Vietnam, and mostly it happened at the beginning of Vietnam, of our involvement there. So like you take a movie like Hamburger Hill. Okay, the battle in Hamburger Hill was unusual. That sort of large scale battle hardly ever happened in Vietnam. And so when you make a movie about an incident like that in Vietnam, and you're trying to like tell the audience, you're trying to like make it seem to the audience that is like a common Vietnam War experience, that's sort of disingenuous, I feel, even though it is a true incident. Okay, so you take there's a couple other movies like that where they depict large battles in Vietnam when these large battles hardly ever took place. Because, again, what was mostly happening in Vietnam was Phoenix program. And Phoenix program is a secret police force. Phoenix program is like the Gestapo in Nazi Germany. The United States funded and designed secret prisons all over Vietnam. They built them all over Vietnam. They spent millions upon millions of dollars building these secret prisons. And they staffed all these prisons with sometimes mostly indigenous Vietnamese types forces. And in different regions, they use different kinds of forces. Some regions, they use police. Okay? Because like if you're trying to root out the secret underground communists in a city, in a dense city, you're probably going to use the police. If you're out in like the jungle and you're going to try to root out the secret communists out in these jungle villages, you might use the military because you don't have any police out there. Okay, so Phoenix program was all encompassing. They arrested people in Phoenix based on informants, and so they made lists and lists of names. And they got these names from informants. They paid, I believe, Chris, informants $6 per name. Wow. So if you were just some like poor Vietnamese villager and you had a fight with somebody in your village, you could just go into the Phoenix office. And by the way, Operation Phoenix, they put flyers up everywhere. They advertised, and they were like, give us names.
Something similar to that as well. That was common practice in World War II. I wonder if the CIA got that from observing how effective the Nazis were in places they occupied for the very same reason.
Well, I'll just say about that, there were people who started working within the Phoenix program and they decided to quit because they said it was Gestapo tactics. They were disgusted by it. And another thing I'll say is the CIA itself as an organization, I believe that now I'm going to get way off topic, but the CIA itself as an organization, I believe, was heavily influenced by Nazi intelligence. Like Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Nazi intelligence, he was brought into the CIA as a consultant at the end of World War II. And he convinced the CIA that, and it was the OSS at the time, he convinced the OSS that the USSR was about to invade the rest of Europe. He convinced the CIA that the USSR was not going to stop at Germany. And he was completely wrong about that. But he did that because he had a Nazi German spy network still living and operating all throughout Russia, all throughout the Eastern Bloc. And he wanted to keep his men active and keep his men alive. So I believe, he lied to the OSS and told them that the USSR was about to invade and about to attack the United States and do all sorts of horrible things. He said whatever it took. And so Gehlen was brought into the CIA and all these. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. But so suffice it to say that I believe, yes. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Operation Phoenix sounds like the Gestapo. Because there's another. I mean, if you want to look up Operation Paperclip, okay, that was a.
Well,
secret.
now you're getting further into World War II and post-war, and getting further away from Vietnam. But I get your point.
Well, just let me say, Operation Paperclip, the CIA brought tons and tons of Nazis into the United States, put them in positions of power, and I'm sure they put Nazis in positions of power within the CIA. I mean, why not? Anyway,
they did, and I mean also. Go on. There was another incident. No one ever makes a movie about the My Lai incident.
Well, the My Lai massacre, you can look it up on Wikipedia if you don't know about it, but it was an incident where a U.S. soldier was disgusted that his fellow soldiers were gunning down innocent civilians. Okay? It got a lot of press, it went to trial, but you know what? That incident was common in Vietnam. Slaughtering innocent civilians was the norm in Vietnam. And the My Lai massacre, things like that were the norm. It's just that this one time, somebody thought it was a horrible thing, and they said something about it. This one time.
So then my question to you is, Randall, especially with the Phoenix program, I just wanted to make a slight dodge, is why do you think we're not making movies about the CIA, about former Nazis, about government-sanctioned violence and approval of using extreme president? Why do we just keep on telling stories from the grunt's point of view?
Well, I mean,
and not from the folks over at the Pentagon and Rand and all the other places that were coming up with these theories? And why do we?
Well, you know why, Chris. You know why? It's because it's the title of this show. It's like these movies are trying to excuse the United States' behavior in Vietnam. That's my belief. So when
you think by making all these characters the grunt, who are clearly, it's kind of like saying, look here, you ever go to a restaurant and your waiter apologizes because they raised the prices, and you say to the waiter, look, I know you don't own the place. I'm not mad at you. It's the same thing, right? When you keep on telling stories from the lowest person on the totem pole's point of view, there's a certain degree of moral exemption because they're not in control in the biggest sense of that word. They're either just following orders or they're caught up in a situation beyond their making. But we never make films about the McGeorge Bundys, the Seven Wise Men, Johnson. We do documentaries every so often, but we never really show. Like there's a movie called the Wannsee Conference. It was made first in German, and then it was remade by Kenneth Branagh in English. And it was a real conference they had at the beginning of World War II, where all these German high commands got together in this lovely village, little chalet over the weekend, to figure out how they would go about putting together the final solution. And it's a chilling film because whether you see either version, because they're very matter of fact about how they work out the logistics of genocide. But say what you will about the movie, at least it shows you how decisions were made at the top. You never see an American version of that in regards to Vietnam because America is still a functioning nation. I mean, you know,
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, you can't make a movie like that about the United States because we're still here. You know, you can make a movie like that about the Nazis who were completely wiped out. Well, let me go through a couple things, some other characteristics of these movies that really show how horrible these movies are when it comes to excusing our behavior in Vietnam. Okay.
okay.
So a lot of these movies, and I grew up watching all these things. I mean, as a kid, I don't know if I could say I loved them. Hey, Chris, are you still there? Okay,
I'm
you
still
just
here. Can
froze
you
for
hear
a
me?
second. Yeah, so I don't know if I could
The
say I
man,
love.
it's the government. They're listening to us. They're trying to
Probably.
block the truth, man, from coming out. They heard us. They've been spying on us. Their algorithm is like, wait, are they about
You
to
know what?
blow the lid
I
off?
wouldn't put it past them. But no, but there's certain characteristics in these movies that you always come up over and over and over, and they show how horrible. And I'm gonna go through a list. It's gonna show how horrible really these movies are when in terms of excusing U.S. behavior in Vietnam. Okay, so like all of these things, it's like the main thing is like you always see American prisoners of war being tortured. And it's true that American prisoners of war were tortured in Vietnam, but we tortured thousands of Vietnamese citizens who probably were innocent, tortured them to death. Maybe tortured up to like 40,000 people to death, some estimates, in the Phoenix program in Vietnam. And the places they were tortured to death, and I will admit, most of the time the torture was done at the hands of Vietnamese interrogators. Okay, from what I've read, but they were done. They were being supervised by people in the CIA, most likely. So thousands, maybe let's just say like 40,000 at least Vietnamese citizens were tortured to death who were innocent. And when the Phoenix program rounded somebody up, when they kicked in somebody's door in the middle of the night and grabbed them out of their bed and took them to the torture chamber. By the way, torture chambers that the United States government designed and built. When they were rounded up and put in the torture chamber, 99% of the time they would die from the torture, Chris. Almost all of these people died from the torture. There was a congressional investigation of the Phoenix program, and in the testimony given by somebody who was in the program, an American, I think somebody in the military branch who worked at one of the centers, he was asked by a senator, this public record, he's asked by a senator, how many people were found innocent when they were arrested in the Phoenix program? And he said he didn't, to his knowledge, nobody, ever. So, and the only reason they were arrested was because somebody gave Phoenix their name.
Wow.
So you see in all these movies, U.S. POWs being tortured. That's the program. That is a systemic program the United States set up in Vietnam to torture completely innocent, probably most of the time, Vietnamese citizens to death. And in these movies, do you see that? Do you see the United States government rounding people up in Vietnam and torturing them to death? No. You see U.S. POWs being captured and tortured. Okay? Another thing you see in these movies is cramped cages, right?
Yeah.
The United States was actually famous for using tiny little cages in Vietnam because the United States was infamous for using, and I had to read about this, but I think people who lived through the era read the stories about this. The United States was infamous for using an old prison that the French had used during the colonial era for discipline, for maintaining their colonial rule. And this prison, I can't remember the name now, I'm sorry, but this prison was infamous for having these little tiny cages they called tiger cages.
Right.
And people would be kept in these. This is like really disturbing, Chris. I'll just say it. But people were kept in these tiny little cramped cages, and that wasn't the only prison with the tiny cages. But people were kept in tiny, cramped cages for so long that they lost the ability to walk upright.
Wow.
And they were going to die anyway eventually. But yeah, okay. So I mean, other things. Okay, so a lot of these Vietnam movies, they depict rape. Okay, so like Casualties of War, right?
Yeah.
What else depicted rapes? Well, Casualties of War.
I get your point. There's a lot of that, and that's
Rape was regularly used in the Phoenix program as a form of quote unquote interrogation.
which is an important thing to draw a distinction between, because normally when you see that kind of violence, it's just bad actors serving in the United States military. It's not part of a government sanction. But what you're saying is no, it was actually part of a government sanction.
I am sure that there are I'm sure there are people who would apologize for Phoenix and say, this was the idea was we're going to fight fire with fire. We're going to use the same tactics the insurgents are using on us. Okay, and they weren't supposed to torture people. They were simply supposed to interrogate people to get information. Right? The idea was you're supposed to arrest somebody, bring them in, try to figure out by questioning if they're a communist, if they're part of the communist insurgency, and then if they are, you're supposed to find out what their role is, find out if you can get more information about other communists, right, from that person. But I mean, Chris, just imagine in practice what would happen. You bring somebody in and you ask, are you a communist? Of course they're going to say no, even if they are. And if they aren't, they're going to say no, of course. So what do? Well, you torture them until they admit they're a communist. And then you ask them for names of other communists, because now you've established they're a communist. They don't want to give you names, because they give you names, they know that those people are going to be brought in and tortured as well. So you keep torturing them until they give you names. Now you bring in the other people, and the cycle continues. I mean, Chris, this program is an absurdity. It's an absurd program. It doesn't make any sense. Okay? The only way Phoenix ever made sense was to strike terror in the population, which was the only real effect it had. The only real effect it had was to strike terror in a population so that they would be too afraid to rise up against the United States. But like a lot of these counterinsurgency measures historically, a lot of these counterinsurgency measures, like what happens with a lot of them, if they're way too heavy-handed, like Phoenix was, is it has the opposite effect, right? It galvanizes people against the occupying power, which is what happened in Vietnam. Phoenix is why the United States lost Vietnam. I mean, you can look at today at other places you can look at places today that are arguably still U.S. colonies, okay? So like, for instance, Japan. I'll probably get in trouble for saying Israel could arguably be a U.S. colony. What else? But Japan for sure. I don't know. Germany. You could arguably say Germany is a U.S. colony. I mean, because there's so many troops in Germany. Any place the U.S. has troops, I mean, you could arguably say is a U.S. colony. Any place the United States is like constantly injecting with U.S. cash to construct institutions that benefit the United States only, that you could argue those places are U.S. colonies. I mean, these are colonies in a modern sense, right? Because colonialism as a system, I think, has grown up, and it's become much more sophisticated than it was like 100 years ago. So what do you think about all this, Chris?
Well, I think I'm not going to address everything, because you did get kind of overly expansive, but I want to go back to the premise, which really does go back to this show, which is that if there's a legacy here originally, when you watch a World War II movie, even to this day, you watch a World War II movie, you get to see top brass. You get to see prime ministers and presidents, and you get to see how everything is done from the top down. Vietnam is still not done from the top down, but a new genre of filmmaking that's been coming out over the last 20 years is the Afghanistan or Iraq movie. And I'm really thinking a lot about Zero Dark 30. And it's interesting because Zero Dark 30 does show you what it looks from the top up, top down. There are actual people who, yes, they come up with an intelligence officer who's she's a woman, she's trying to get by, she gets caught up in something behind her, but we do see one or two. No, actually it follows the exact formula. But here it deals with the torture that was actually done, which is something that was missing in Vietnam films. But it plays the great game of moral three-card Monty, which is it shows you now torture, it shows you the Abu Ghraib, it shows you what's wrong, but then it says, but these guys were really bad and we have to kill Osama bin Laden. So on one hand, people praise it because they're like, hey, they showed what was really going on. But on the other hand, and then compare that with American Sniper, which is also about that same war. Clint Eastwood does a lovely, like as if the Vietnam War movie never existed. And he does this lovely movie where you never really see what's the point of view of the other side. And then there's finally, let me just finish this out, Paul Schrader, who I think did work on one of these Vietnam films, but I can't remember which. But Paul Schrader did a movie recently with Oscar Isaac, where he's a gambler. But before he was a gambler, he worked at an Abu Ghraib place and he tortured people. And it does seem like where we're going, like it seems like the difference between what's missing from the Vietnam War movie that we have now in the Iraq Afghanistan War movie is this thing that, yes, we're now going to show the torture stuff, but we're still going to play that game that we started out in Vietnam War movies that our hero is not responsible. Or maybe this is true, but remember 9/11, which is like saying, remember whatever atrocity happens, Pork Chop Hill, Pearl Harbor, it's this very, like we got to do bad things because the people we're fighting do bad things. And that's, you could literally justify anything with that that moral equivalency. If there's no point in having law, order, civility, or even a Geneva Convention if you're just going to tell hero stories. Can I just make one?
Yeah.
Totally, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I got to say it because it was just. I was just watching Bill Maher on Friday. I'm sure Bill Maher does not watch us, but he did do a really, 99% of what he says, I go, no, you're a moron. But he did make a point that here is Hollywood constantly talking about liberal ideas and progressive policies, and they get very upset when there's a gun shooting in any high school or anywhere in public, an active shooter. But in every movie that comes out, violence in mainstream cinema is always justified. You know what I'm saying? Our hero has a right to morally transgress because the villain is always so bad that the rules of civility exempts our hero from having any rules of civility, which is, in a way, really, if you want to say it, I mean, yes, I think the Vietnam War was the first morally reprehensible war. And the way that we dealt with it is, yes, it's morally reprehensible, but we fought morally reprehensible people, and we're better now. And if we're not better now, it's only because the people we're fighting are even worse. And that's a very dishonest trick. And cinema, which does an amazing job of making violence exciting. The number one movie at the time of this recording is Top Gun. Top Gun Maverick, which, if you remember from Top Gun 1, Pete Mitchell's dad died fighting in Vietnam. So there's even a Vietnam connection to Top Gun. But there is this feeling, there is an emotion. So Bertolt Brecht, he came up with this thing in the 1920s called the alienation effect, the estrangement effect. And he felt that the problem with entertainment is you get so caught up in the emotions that you no longer have critical thinking. So that art was starting to come out that didn't challenge you to question society, but simply affirmed your own preconceived beliefs. So he wanted to create uh, in Brechtian theater. He and Eric Bentley wrote about this, a separation so that you don't get caught up in the emotions and you can critically think. We have always treated Vietnam and all the war movies, because basically Vietnam movies are the template of the modern war movie, whatever the war is after Vietnam, of getting you so emotionally charged by what's going on in the moment that you are no longer critically thinking, wait a second, how did we get here? What are we doing here? Why is this person here? Why are these orders coming out? And that's what you're really saying. And considering that we make so many great documentaries, considering we write so many good works of reportage and essays, and considering how overly liberal Hollywood is in every other subject, it's insane that when it comes to Vietnam or when it comes to war movies after Vietnam, we still play this dishonest game of pretending that these decisions just come from some mysterious force in the universe, like the Sith, or maybe even they're just bad Jedi. They mean well, but they're bad Jedi. But don't think too hard is the consistent message of every Vietnam War movie. It's don't think too hard. Feel a lot, and then get your emotional catharsis. But don't ask the big questions. What you're doing right now, Randall, is you're asking the big questions. And while you're not getting maybe great answers, you are pointing out that that even modern day propaganda, it looks like it's not propaganda, but it's in fact propaganda. It's like the most Gen X-y thing we could ever say on this show. Now, that anti-war thing is actually pretty pro-war, and I love pro-war. Don't get me wrong. I am not saying I agree with you in a political sense, but I absolutely agree with your critique that there is such hypocrisy and such dishonesty, and all this is doing is affirming people's own ignorance. Because you leave these movies not really questioning. I will say the one movie that I felt did a good job is Tell It to the Spartans, because it does point out the futility of the entire experience, and that it's literally a waste of everybody's time, and is essentially there was a guy named Randall Terry who wrote a book called Bloods, which he was an African American reporter for one of the major news outlets, and he interviewed Vietnam soldiers who were black in the 60s. He came to my college in the 80s, and he was the one who recommended. I asked him, what's the best movie ever made about Vietnam? And he said, go Tell It to the Spartans. The title itself comes from Theopolis. It had been based on a guy who had been a writer for The Nation, who had been in Vietnam in '64, and had one of the places he had gone with the advisors. There was a French cemetery of soldiers who had died 10 years earlier. And it really does. I'm not saying the movie is great. It's not. It's by Ted Post, who did one of my favorite Planet of the Apes movies, Beneath the Planet of the Apes. But at least Go Tell It to the Spartans is so insanely nihilistic. Wouldn't you say, Randall? So insanely nihilistic.
Yeah, so I wasn't aware that
you can't at least walk away going, well, they did their best. None of it.
Yeah, so I wasn't that aware of this movie. I wasn't aware of this movie, and you told me about it. And after reading all this stuff about Operation Phoenix, yeah, I did find this movie realistic. I think in the way that the grunt, the average military guy, because the thing about the average military guy, their experience in Vietnam, because the thing about Operation Phoenix is, and Phoenix was the start, I think, of wars run by the CIA.
Yeah,
because every war after Vietnam, I think, was run by the CIA. And every branch of the military is subservient to the CIA in every single one of these wars. And what and what is the CIA doing exactly? I mean, nobody knows, Chris, because literally the CIA is a black box, and nobody's allowed to know what the CIA does, what their intentions are. I mean, we're in a ridiculous situation since Vietnam, because in America, our entire military is run by the CIA, and nobody knows anything about what the CIA does
I
or
would say the
wants.
best movie that has ever come close to touching that subject, Randall, was directed by Costa Gravas, who did a number of great political films in other countries, but he did one film in America about the CIA and the Chilean in '72 and how they overthrew the Pinochet government. It stars Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek, based on a true story. Jack Lemmon's son disappears, and it goes not just which is a very personal story, but while you're learning all that personal stuff, you're also learning about the CIA involvement in overthrowing a democratically elected leader. And I actually studied the CIA files that were declassified years later because I was so fascinated by it. And it's a pretty accurate accounting of what happened. Costas Gravas did State of Siege. He did one about. He did a lot of political films, but this is one of the few that he's ever done in America where you really get to see anything where the CIA is truly honestly held to account, as opposed to, oh, here's a bad apple at the CIA. And that's the thing. I mean, in general, we don't do a lot of Jean Le Carré novels because he's critical of the CIA. We don't do a lot of Graham Greene novels because he's critical of the CIA. The CIA, which is really the missing character in a lot of the films you've talked about, they're treated as James Bond.
Yeah, I've seen.
Or they're this cliche guy, and sometimes I've actually heard Phoenix mentioned, but it's like some bad guy in an X-Men movie, like, oh yeah, he's ex-CIA, he was kicked out because he did some dirty ops. It's like, okay, great. Like, again, it's always the individual, never the government's policy, and that's insane. I'm sorry, I got nothing left to say on this, Randall, but if you do, go ahead. I'm just going to say, good on you, man.
Well, I guess. I mean, I still think these movies are. I don't know. Is enjoyable the right word for these kind of movies?
Well, they're still look. A lot of these are great films.
True.
Just keep in mind that they're not really giving you the bigger. They're not asking the bigger question, and you're not going to walk away with the bigger answer beyond the cliche. War is hell. War is hell. War. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, great. Now, but I would hope if they make another movie about war, and I think, Randall, I'm sorry, I don't mean to steal your thunder, but I would hope that we would make something better than what we've made. But since I just saw Top Gun 3, where we fight an invisible enemy, that's not even a spoiler. Well, everyone knows that. A rogue state.
Rogue state, right.
We'll just continue to make more movies where the motivations and the villains just don't matter.
I like how you said that, how you described the CIA as the missing character in a lot of these stories. But yeah, I think a lot of these movies, I remember,
they're the unseen protagonists. They're the ones, the chess master.
Right. And a lot of war movies, Chris, like all these Vietnam movies, a lot of war movies, I have gone over time, even when I was young, I would go away from the movie after watching it and think, there's something missing. Like, I didn't really understand Vietnam any better after watching this movie.
Right.
Right.
I just saw Top Gun 3 Maverick. Great film. Go and see it. It's awesome. But you never stop to think, oh, wait a second. Are they in the business of killing people?
Yeah, so
Did they kill somebody in that movie? I'm not giving anything away. I don't even know, to be honest with you. I got so caught up in the sensorama of the movie. I honestly don't know if they killed anybody or nobody. And so it's not a spoiler. I'm just saying the enemy seems so faceless in these movies. So it's porn. It's really just porn.
In a certain sense, yeah. And in a certain sense, I think a lot of these war movies, I mean, the Vietnam movies included, perhaps, a lot of these war movies, Top Gun as well, the new Top Gun, they want you to believe that war, conflict, armed conflict, violent conflict that where people die from, They want you to believe that it's like an inevitability, like it happens like the weather, right?
Yeah. And
It's
I'm
like,
not
oh,
saying
we're gonna go to
look,
war
there's
someday.
nothing
It's gonna
more
happen.
like like any porn, there's nothing wrong with it. If that's what gets you off, it's just don't confuse porn with love or romance. Love and romance requires deeper, more profound understanding of yourself, the person you're in love with, and the context in which that happens. And war movies that we've talked about would require not an understanding of yourself, but an understanding of the government and the people who are making our protagonists do the things our protagonists shouldn't be doing.
I mean, maybe in a certain sense, people just don't want to hear that story, don't want to see that story. I mean, I don't know though, Chris. I mean, uh, Kubrick was famous for making Paths of Glory, I think the movie is, where he does try to analyze
Right.
why the certain things are happening in the war on the battlefield. He goes all the way up to the top. And I don't understand why more movies can't be like that. I mean, that is a great movie.
Yeah, but I would say my critique of Paths of Glory, Doctor Strangelove, and the third of that Full Metal Jacket is he's an absurdist. And because he's an absurdist, it's an easy out. If everybody's just crazy, if everybody is just satirically corrupt, then you, the audience, are always in a superior position. And that's the problem, is the audience is always in a superior position. And if the audience is in a superior position, then they leave the movie feeling, well, I would never do that if I was Secretary of State.
Well, you don't believe sometimes people at the top are corrupt. That's why the war happened. I mean, don't you
Well,
think that?
they're painted in a way that lets the audience off the hook. There's no collective shame when you watch a Vietnam movie. There should be. There should be collective shame when you watch a Vietnam film.
I
If I was
mean,
German and I was watching a movie about what it was like to be a German soldier in World War II, I would hope there'd be some collective shame.
well,
And maybe there is, but there
is
is no collective shame when you watch a Vietnam movie. It's always about the individual getting a hard, oh, that poor fella. He had no other opportunities in life, so he had to do this.
yeah. I mean, you're making a good point. I mean, it's. I think it's hard for Americans to say that uh, our systemic actions in any kind of theater, either in war or anywhere, it was just plain wrong or even evil. When I mean,
Well, it's not like the British are
the,
not much better when they talk about their time in India. So in that sense, we're no different than any other empire. You
true,
know,
true, but I guess the Germans can't let themselves off the hook so easy because of the Nazi experience.
exactly.
Um, but the
We
Nazi
should learn from them.
well, because the Germans, the Nazis, that experience isn't so much different from these other experiences. I mean, um, there were U.S. generals. I can't remember who, but I know that after World War II, U.S. generals said, "Well, if we had lost the war, we'd be up for war crimes too." They said about Nuremberg, and because, yeah. So you're right, Chris. I mean, there should there should be an acknowledgement that mistakes have been made, and they shouldn't be made again. There should be some shame. I mean, I think that's a perfect way of putting it, Chris.
It's a shame-free genre, and that's wrong because we're talking about if you say that we were evil, then where's the collective guilt at the end of the movie?
Yeah,
Oh,
so
that Adrian Cronauer, he meant so well.
right. So it's almost like at the end of the day, all these Vietnam movies are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to pat ourselves on the back. Oh, it's all right. It's
Yeah,
all right. We screwed up a
it's
few
okay.
places,
It's
but
okay. Still a good boy. You're a good boy. Yeah, you shot a couple innocent people, but look, you didn't have a lot of options in life. You're a good boy.
I mean, I am
We're all Dylan
almost.
Cooper, who was the one in Wisconsin who got away with shooting everybody.
I don't remember. I don't remember.
It was like what's his face? A teenage boy shot a bunch of people in Wisconsin. Boy, are people gonna get pissed off. I don't give a shit. But we're all him, right? We're just like, well, we're like that kid in Wisconsin who got let go for shooting people because
Oh yeah,
hey, we're
yeah.
good kids. We didn't have any. We Doesn't
Yeah.
even matter his name. His name's immaterial because that's the society we are. We are a society that is constantly looking for ways of forgiving the worst aspects of ourselves, the most violent parts of ourselves. We constantly say, well, they had it coming, or well, they had a poor upbringing, or they were just following orders. But no questions get asked, and therefore the story just continues and on, and that's absurd. It's like if you watched a romantic comedy and every romantic comedy ended with a couple going, yeah, you know what, I'm not really that into you. No, neither am I. And then they go find other people. The end. I mean, it's the same idea. It's like, well, every other kind of genre, there's a come to Jesus moment, as they say. There's a moment of catharsis and realization that you can be a better person, but you can't do that with a country. You know what I'm saying? You can't tell a story about a nation becoming a better person. That doesn't that because it's not true. Nations don't become better people. Nations aren't people. And because nations aren't people, every time you make a war movie, you always are going to end up with this false pat on the back. Doesn't matter what the next war is.
I think the British, I mean,
Guarantee you CIA will do something Phoenix like again, and we'll make movies where we'll touch on it.
Well, one of the problems. I mean, you're really nailing.
What a brave film!
You're really nailing it, Chris. Because it's like, is there, is there anything that the United States could do that the United States would be ashamed of? That the U.S. people would be ashamed of? I mean, I almost think there's nothing.
No, nothing at all. I've seen enough movies about civil rights, internments, gay rights, slavery. We always go, but we always use that with some kind of excuse, like, well, you have to understand at that period in history, that's what people thought were right, or you have to understand they just didn't know any better. Or you have to understand that one individual, he saw the light, so not everybody was bad. It's like we just can't really deal with these bigger issues because we don't want to hold our governments accountable because we are a representation of our government. Okay, I didn't vote for the people who made Vietnam because I was like a child, but clearly somebody in my family or somebody who was an elder what I respected did. But we don't want to assign blame. We don't want to do that because we don't want to take the responsibility. So we keep on making movies where almost every one of our war movies are, in some sense, a perverse rationalization for violence.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, why they made it all? I mean, they're glorifications
It's
of
what film
going
does
to
best.
war.
Film does it well. Film captures that shot, and it makes it so good. It makes it so good that we give Tom Cruise like $1 billion. I mean, it is hot. But we should just admit that. If we just admitted that we as a society has a hard on for violence, then at least we could say, look, this is not about politics. This is just like, how cool would it feel right now to either get shot at or to shoot someone? And if we just admitted that, we could separate that whole thing from war movies.
Yeah, I mean, well, and everybody has to pretend like I don't know, they wouldn't want to see a war. War is a horrible thing when they're watching movies about it.
Okay, well, I'm getting afraid if I say anything more, I'm gonna get into trouble. So
You know what, Chris? I'm surprised because like on this topic, you went way farther than I think even I did.
I know. So I'm just shutting down. I've given you guys enough of my point of view, and Randall, you pulled the rug out, and you kicked the hornet's nest, buddy. You kicked the
Well,
hornet's nest.
I'll just want to end by saying, America, be better.
And peace.